Well, again, just wanted to wish you guys a Merry Christmas. My name is Nate Ingvoldstad, one of the pastors here at Grace Church. We want to welcome you tonight to our Christmas Eve service. We're excited to have you here as together we get to worship God and worship Jesus, that this is the reason that He came, He became man, dwelt among us, and we're here tonight to worship Him because of that. And so we want this to be just a good family event. We have our kids all in with us. Kids, I want to hear you when we sing. So we're going to have you here with us. We're going to share some stories from the Bible. But then we're also going to do a time we're just going to sing together. So we're going to carol together, lift our voices up to God in praise. And we'll do that together. So that'll be a fun thing to do. My family and I, though, were missionaries. Before we came to the Grace Church, we were missionaries on this little tiny island in the middle of nowhere, Philippines. We were there for quite a few years, over 12 years. So if we were there tonight, and we were able to see a church raised up, so we had believers, and if we were there tonight, I would greet you guys in a different way. I would be able to say something like this, and you'd say, "Magandang hapon po kanindong tanan, maligayang Pasko, grabing mambung ako na di ka mo kanakon. Salamat sa Diyos, salamat sa ating Panginoon, na tana ating managlibre." So it's kind of similar to English. It sounds real similar. Not much of a difference there. But the island we lived on, this island in the middle of nowhere, it didn't have a lot of electricity. In fact, there was no permanent source of power. There was a few generators people might have that sometimes there would be lights, but there was no permanent source of power. And so because of that, light became a very important thing to us. Having light, being able to see, was a very important thing to us. Now here in Ramona, we can't totally relate, right? We have light everywhere. You go outside, there's street lights, right? Stopped lights. We have little LED lights that we have back here, Christmas tree lights. We have lights on timers. Right? We even have a thing called light pollution. We have lights everywhere we go. But if you were to go maybe out to the desert, if you were to go even up into the Sierras, right? You can get back into places that are truly, truly dark. And at night, if there's no moon, it's overcast, you can get to a place that is almost pitch black. It is dark. Have you ever been in a truly dark place where you needed a light to be able to rescue you? Have you ever been in one of those places where you didn't have a light, but you needed a light there to rescue you? You know, that's exactly the situation that I found myself in about 4.5 years ago as I sat alone on this little island in the middle of nowhere, Philippines. You see, about a week before that, I'd left my wife and my kids in Manila. My wife was pregnant with our youngest son, Jacob. So we have 4 kids, Addie, Joanna, Mia, and Jacob. And my wife was pregnant with Jacob, and she was feeling sick, and so we decided, you know what, honey, instead of you going back with me to the island, why don't you guys just hang out here for a few weeks, and I'll come back and get you. And so I'm there on the island that night, and I get this cell phone, this call. It's about 11 o'clock, and I get a call, which is a bit miraculous in and of itself. There's actually one place in our house where if you put the cell phone at this 45-degree angle, it's usually 3 inches to the right of the kitchen, the faucet, about 3 inches up is a little shelf. And if you put it right there, you get 2 bars of signal. 1 bar gives you a text, 2 bars you can voice talk. And so I had 2 bars there, and I get this little call. I get a call from my wife. And she says, "Nate, I'm in trouble." And she was afraid that she was going to lose Jacob that night. The little baby that's in her belly, she's afraid she's going to lose him. So she says, "I got to go to the hospital right now." And at that point, I realized I'm in a bad spot. I'm far from my wife and kids, at least an hour boat ride, 8-hour car ride, plus an hour on a plane, and then you got to deal with Manila traffic. Right? That's how far I am away from my family. And I realize that I'm in a bad position. Right? My wife's getting cared for, but with somebody else. My kids are with other people. They need me, and I'm not there. And so immediately I realized, I need to leave. So I put my things in my backpack and I head out into the night. And that night it was raining, it was overcast, it was windy, it was dark, not the night you want to travel. And so I made it down to the ocean where we would launch our boats from. And our boats there weren't like your boats here where it's on a pier or a jetty out into the ocean that you can hop on. These are actually beached up on the land. And so it takes about 20 different men or 20 different people to actually launch this boat. And so it's 11 o'clock at night, and I'm going through the village, and I'm banging on things, telling people to wake up. And I finally rouse about 20 different guys to come help me, and we put this boat, this outrigger boat, onto our shoulders, and we launch it out into the water. And as I climb on, I realize, again, how deep I am in trouble. And the only guy with me is one of my best friends there, a man named Saling. And Saling is at the tail, so he's steering the boat, he's driving it, and I head out to the very front, as far as I can get to the front. And I grab this flashlight, and I shine that light out into the water as far as I can see. Because I know out there's logs in the water, things that have been brushed up from the storm. I know if we hit one of them, our prop just is going to tank, and we're going to be stranded in the water. I'm looking, straining, because I know that there's waves that have been just chopped up from that wind that are just splashing all over the place. And I need to be able to see where this prevailing wind or wave is coming from so I can see the direction that we need to go. And then I know farther on, there's these rocks. Right before we get to the mainland, there's these jagged, knife-like rocks that stick out of the water. And I know if I can't see those rocks, this rescue attempt is over. If we're going to crash into them, and then where will I be? And so I remember that night straining and just being so thankful that I had this light, this guide, this thing to rescue me through this storm. Because I had this light, I was rescued and I knew where to go. But I often think back and I remember this time and I wonder, where would I have been without that light to rescue me and to guide me? Where would I have been?
The nation of Israel was in need of rescue. The nation of Israel was in need of rescue, God's chosen people. The reason why is because the duel between Pharaoh and God had ended in the decimation of the people in the land of Egypt. The 10 plagues left the land absolutely destroyed, and the 10th plague in particular left every home in Egypt wailing with grief for the loss of a loved one. Even Pharaoh himself closed the eyes of his firstborn son in death. And Pharaoh finally capitulated and let the people of Israel go. And so the Israelites, about 3,000 strong, under the leadership of Moses, fled east towards the Sinai Peninsula and beyond to the Promised Land. And as God led them in the pillar of cloud and fire, they went through a gap in the mountains to a broad plain, and in front of them was the Red Sea. And so they found themselves trapped. 3,000 ex-slaves trapped on this plain with the Red Sea in front of them, the mountains flanking them, and the Egyptian army bearing down on them. And you can imagine the fury of Pharaoh, still thinking that he can best the God of Israel, still thinking that he can recapture the Israelites who have been his free slave labor to build his cities over the decades, still thinking that he can win. And from the Israelite standpoint, they were in an impossible situation. They were trapped. There was no human way out. They were going to feel the lash of Pharaoh once again in great retribution and anger and fury for what he and his people have suffered at the hands of the God of Israel. It was a hopeless situation. But then God, through his light, rescued them. The Bible tells us that God's angel, the angel of God, had been leading Israel from the front in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And on this night, as the Israelites were encamped and trapped between the sea and the Egyptians, the angel of God shifted to behind the encampment, and the pillar of fire burned all night. And Moses said that it lit up the sky, and it kept the Egyptian armies from attacking Israel. And as the angel of God and the light of God rescued Israel, God opened up the pathway of the Red Sea, and 3 million Israelites traveled across on dry ground with all of their livestock, with all of their little ones. And when they were safely across on the Sinai Peninsula, then the pillar of fire, God's light that was rescuing them, moved once again to lead his people. And Pharaoh, in his insane arrogance and insane desire to best the God of Israel, sent his troops into the Red Sea. And as they did so, the waters collapsed and destroyed the mightiest army in the world at that time. And God's light rescued his people. But you see, Israel needed to be rescued not only physically, but Israel also needed to be rescued spiritually. You see, while they were in Egypt for 400 years, they had fallen into spiritual darkness by embracing the false gods of the Egyptians. They had begun to worship the sun god Ra. They had begun to worship the futility goddesses. They began to worship the gods who were in the form of flies and cows and nature around them. They had plunged into spiritual darkness, not only in their physical slavery, but they became spiritual slaves to those who are demonic. And God needed to rescue his people spiritually. And so during those 40 years of wandering, God gave his light, his spiritual light, to Moses and the people through his law which is good and right and expresses the goodness and the righteousness and the compassion and mercy of God. And he rescued his people not only physically at the Red Sea, but he was rescuing his people spiritually as he revealed himself through his law and began to rebuild a personal relationship with his people. God led them through the light of the angel of God in the pillar of fire and the cloud by day and the fire by night. And he eventually brought them to the land of promise after 40 years. And God dwelt in the midst of his people. He continued to lead them. His light, his Shekinah glory, continued to dwell in the midst of his people in the Holy of Holies, the inner room of the tabernacle, the place of worship where Israel would come to worship God. And God continued to lead his people through his law. And King David would come to say about God's law that it was a lamp unto his feet and a light unto his path. That those who followed the law of God experienced the blessings of God, the prosperity of God, the security of God, the peace of God. Later, through Solomon, a permanent temple, a permanent dwelling place was crafted for God there in Jerusalem, and his Shekinah glory, his light, continued to dwell in the midst of the people. His law continued to be taught, but the people, like they did in Egypt, began to drift away from God and dabble in the false gods of the Canaanites, ugly gods, gods that demanded the sacrifice of infants in fire in order to be worshipped. Sexual immorality was part of their worship. It was ugly, the Canaanite gods. And Israel once again slipped into spiritual darkness and needed rescuing. Well, God sent his prophets, and he warned the people of Israel to come back into a right relationship with God, to come back into once again live according to his law and experience the blessings and the beauty of walking in the light of God's truth. He warned them that if you do not, I will discipline you in order to bring you back. I love you as a father loves his children. I will discipline you. And then God also, in the midst of these strong warnings through the Old Testament prophets, he promised that he would once again send his light to rescue them from their spiritual darkness, because he knew the hearts of his people. And he knew that even as he warned them, they would still continue in their pathway into darkness. And that's exactly what happened. So that in 723 BC, 10 of the northern tribes were conquered by the Assyrian Empire, and they were deported from the land. The 2 southern tribes still didn't learn. Their hearts continued to drift away from God into darkness. And finally, in 586 BC, God allowed the Babylonians to come and to invade and conquer those final 2 tribes. And it was in those dark days that God's Shekinah glory, the glory of Israel, the light that rescues and leaves, left the temple. And God removed his presence from his people. And the temple went dark.
The light of God had left the temple, the light that had led them, the light that had rescued them, and he was gone. He had promised that he would come back. He had promised that the light would return. And they waited. And a few remembered. And they established a celebration of when God had first come and led them. It was called the Feast of Sukkot. And for 500 years, the glory of the Lord was gone from them. And for over 500 years, they clung to this promise that the light that had rescued them, that had been in front of them, this pillar of fire that had led them and protected them, would come back. For over 500 years, they clung to this promise. And they established this festival, this week-long festival, where they would set up tents. The Jewish people would set up tents. And they would dwell in these tents for a week, reminding them, yes, we remember when we were in the wilderness and we didn't have a home, where God was leading us to where he would bring us into the promised land. And they set up these tents. And then they would come and gather together on the last day in this giant worship ceremony called the illumination of the temple. You see, they had the temple, but the glory of the Lord was gone from it. And so they had in the temple these candelabras, these torches that were 75 feet high, twice as tall as this building. These oil lamps. And in the night of the celebration, they would sing these praises and they would light these lamps and it would illuminate the entire city. These glowing pillars. And they would remember the glory of the Lord that was once with them. And it was far greater than the light of these candles. Even in their magnificence, they paled in comparison. 580 years. There's a man, he comes into the temple during the Feast of Sukkot. As the illumination is about to happen, he's sitting there, a man about my age in his early 30s, a man named Jesus, this carpenter's boy from Nazareth. He's kind of been moving around and teaching, and he's sitting in the temple as they're preparing to light these candles, to worship and to remember the promise. Man, someday the light of God will return to his people. And we'll light these candles and we'll celebrate because we believe the promises of God. And this carpenter's boy stands up in this moment where they're about to light these giant pillars of fire. And he cries out in the temple. He says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. This Jesus, this carpenter's boy, who was raised out in Nazareth, that only a few years before even was a name that anybody knew, is standing, and he's taking this image, the light that God used to lead his people. He's saying, that is me. See, this time God didn't send a pillar of fire. This time God didn't bring a cloud to lead his people. This time God came. The Son of God came. I am the light of the world. Not there is the light of the world, or I bring the light of the world. The glory of the Lord returned to the temple in the man Jesus Christ. And when John is writing his gospel, he makes it clear that this time the rescue isn't from slavery to Egypt. The Jewish people at this time are enslaved to Rome. They've been passed on as a piece of property for 500 years. This time the rescue doesn't come from Egypt. It doesn't come from Rome. It doesn't come from stormy seas and trials and tribulations. This time, the light of the world that would rescue and lead God's people is to rescue his people from the real, true, deepest problem they have. That is to rescue them from their sins. Not from the darkness without, not from the darkness of pagan countries and pagan gods, but to rescue them from this promise, this problem they have that no human solution had ever been found for. To rescue them from the penalty of their sins. That they are not right with God. And they'd been waiting. How is God going to rescue us? And God knew the true problem. And so he sent Jesus into the world. And John, one of Jesus' best friends, as he records in his gospel this story of the light that has come to the world, the light that has led the people of God for this many years, the light that these people waited over 500 years in expectation for, that is here in the person of Jesus Christ. This is what John says in the beginning of his gospel. Let me read it to you. As John has now experienced this life with Jesus, he's seen him die for the sins of the world, and he's seen him raised from the dead. And as he thinks back on when that person of Jesus Christ, this God made flesh, when he came into the world, and we sit in the same place that John did. We look back. Tomorrow is the day we've set aside to look back and remember the day when the God-man became flesh, when God became a man. And this is how John chooses to describe that event. It's unusual. It's not like any of you would describe the birth of your children into the world. This is how John describes it. Speaking of Jesus, in him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all men might believe through him. He was not the light. He came only to bear witness about the light. Because the true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He, Jesus, was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who receive him, who believe in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of flesh, nor of the will of man, but born of God, the true children of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory as of the Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. The glory of the Lord that led his people, that rescued his people from Egypt. The glory of the Lord that led his people through the wilderness and continued to provide for them and rested in the temple. The glory of the Lord that left the temple is the glory of the Lord that we find in the man Jesus Christ. And tomorrow, as we celebrate the birth of Jesus Christ, this is what we remember. We remember, as John chose to describe it, the light of the world that has come into darkness. The light of the world that has come into a dark world, and the light of the world that has come into our dark hearts. To bring light, which is the life of men, which is the true life that God would give us. And so we're going to sing a couple more songs, but as we move from this building and we drive around and we see the beautiful Christmas lights on trees, we see wreaths lit up, we see buildings lit up, our houses are lit with trees, we wear things with lights, there's lights everywhere. May they be a reminder of the true light that gives life to all who will believe. And if this afternoon finds you in a place where you're unsure whether or not you have that life, may this be the night you believe. Many of us would love to speak with you and answer any questions you have. But let's continue to celebrate and worship the Lord in song.